Imagine taking a bite of bread so hard it could chip your teeth, made from flour mixed with sawdust, chalk, and sometimes ground bones. Picture washing it down with ale that's safer than water because the water itself could kill you within hours. Welcome to dinner in medieval Europe, where a single bad harvest meant entire villages would resort to eating bark, grass, and if they were desperate enough, each other. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, the vast majority of Europeans lived in a world where food wasn't just scarce. It was dangerous, disgusting, and often deadly. This wasn't simply about having less variety than we do today. Medieval food was fundamentally different in ways that would shock and horrify modern eaters. The very act of eating was fraught with risks that could kill you, slowly poison you, or leave you wishing you were dead. But why was medieval food so spectacularly awful? The answer lies in a perfect storm of factors. Climate disasters, primitive preservation methods, non-existent food safety standards, crushing poverty, and a social system designed to funnel the best food upward to the nobility, while leaving the masses to subsist on scraps that wouldn't be fit for livestock today. The medieval period began with the collapse of Roman infrastructure and trade networks, plunging Europe into what historians once called the Dark Ages. Suddenly, the sophisticated food distribution systems that had fed the Roman Empire crumbled. No more exotic spices from India, no more reliable grain shipments from Egypt, no more olive oil from Spain reaching the furthest corners of the empire. Instead, communities became isolated, forced to survive on whatever they could grow, hunt, or forage within walking distance of their villages. This isolation had devastating consequences for food quality and variety. Without trade networks, entire regions became dependent on single crops. In Northern Europe, that crop was usually rye or barley, grains that were hardy enough to survive in poor soil and harsh climates, but also prone to a deadly fungus called ergot. When people ate ergot-contaminated grain, they suffered from a condition called St. Anthony's fire, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and eventually gangrene that would literally cause their limbs to fall off. But even when crops weren't infected with deadly fungi, medieval agriculture was a disaster waiting to happen. Farmers had no understanding of crop rotation, soil chemistry, or selective breeding. They used wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of the soil, relied on oxen that were often too weak from malnutrition to do heavy work, and had no effective fertilizers beyond animal dung and human waste. The result was yields so low they would be laughable if they weren't so tragic. A good harvest might produce only 4 or 5 times the amount of seed planted. Compare that to modern agriculture, where yields can be 50 to 100 times higher. Medieval farmers were constantly teetering on the edge of starvation, and when harvests failed, which happened regularly due to floods, droughts, or early frosts, entire communities faced death. These harvest failures weren't rare events. They happened roughly once every 7 years, and when they did, the results were catastrophic. The Great Famine of 1315-1322 killed millions across Europe. People ate grass, bark, and leather. They boiled their shoes and belts to make soup. Parents abandoned their children because they couldn't feed them. Some resorted to cannibalism, with reports of people eating the bodies of hanged criminals and even their own deceased family members. But even in good times, the quality of food was appalling by modern standards. Medieval preservation methods were primitive and often ineffective. Without refrigeration, meat had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, processes that often failed, leaving food partially rotten. Salt was expensive and often contaminated with dirt, sand, and other impurities. Smoking often didn't penetrate deep enough into large pieces of meat, leaving the interior to rot while the outside appeared preserved. The result was that much of the meat consumed in medieval times was at least partially spoiled. People learned to recognize different stages of decay and adjust their cooking methods accordingly. Meat that was merely slimy might be acceptable if cooked thoroughly. Meat that had a greenish tinge might be soaked in wine or vinegar to mask the taste of rot. Only when meat was completely putrid and crawling with maggots would it be discarded, and even then, it might be fed to pigs or dogs. Fish was even worse. Without effective preservation methods, fish would begin to rot within hours of being caught. Salted fish was a staple of the medieval diet, but the salting process was often inadequate, and the fish would arrive at market already decomposing. The smell of medieval fish markets must have been overwhelming, a mixture of salt, rot, and decay that could be detected from blocks away. Bread, the staple food for most medieval Europeans, was adulterated with whatever cheap fillers bakers could find. During times of grain shortage, bread might contain sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, bean flour, or even clay. These adulterants weren't just unappetizing, they were often dangerous. Chalk could cause kidney stones, sawdust was indigestible and could cause intestinal blockages, and some adulterants contained toxic substances that could cause slow poisoning. The grinding process itself introduced contaminants. Medieval millstones were made of porous stone that would gradually wear away, leaving grit and stone particles in the flour. This stone dust would wear down people's teeth, causing dental problems that could lead to serious infections. Wealthy people who could afford finer flour often had better teeth than the poor, who ate coarser bread full of grit and impurities. But the problems with medieval bread went beyond adulterants and stone dust. The fermentation process was unpredictable and often went wrong. Without understanding of yeast and bacterial cultures, medieval bakers relied on wild yeasts and whatever bacterial cultures happened to be present in their environment. Sometimes this worked fine, producing decent bread. Other times, harmful. Bacteria would dominate, creating bread that was sour, moldy, or even toxic. Storage was another major problem. Grain was stored in wooden bins, clay pots, or woven baskets that offered little protection from moisture, insects, or rodents. Rats and mice contaminated grain stores with their droppings and urine, spreading diseases like plague and typhus. Insects laid eggs in stored grain, and people would often eat bread that was full of weevils, beetles, and other bugs. The water situation was even more dire than the food situation. Most medieval water sources were contaminated with human and animal waste. Wells were often dug too close to latrines, allowing sewage to seep into the water supply. Rivers and streams served as both water sources and sewers, with people dumping waste upstream from where others drew their drinking water. As a result, waterborne diseases were rampant. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever regularly swept through medieval communities, killing thousands. People learned that water was dangerous, so they drank ale, wine, or other fermented beverages whenever possible. Even children drank weak ale instead of water because the fermentation process killed many of the harmful bacteria. But this created its own problems. Medieval ale and beer were often contaminated with bacteria that weren't killed during fermentation. They were stored in wooden barrels that could harbor harmful microorganisms, and they were often adulterated with dangerous substances. Some unscrupulous brewers added plants like henbane or nightshade to make their ale more intoxicating, not realizing these plants were poisonous. The social structure of medieval society made food problems even worse. The feudal system concentrated the best food in the hands of the nobility, leaving the vast majority of the population to survive on scraps. Lords and ladies dined on fresh meat, white bread, and imported spices, while their serfs ate black bread, gruel, and whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. This inequality wasn't just about quantity. It was about quality and safety. The wealthy could afford fresh food, while the poor ate whatever they could get, no matter how spoiled or contaminated it might be. The wealthy had access to spices that could mask the taste of spoiled food and had antibacterial properties. The poor had to eat rotten food without any way to make it safer or more palatable. The church also played a role in making food problems worse. Religious authorities promoted frequent fasting and dietary restrictions that often coincided with times when food was already scarce. During Lent, people were forbidden from eating meat, eggs, or dairy products for 40 days, often the hungriest time of year when winter stores were running low and spring crops hadn't yet been harvested. These religious restrictions weren't just inconvenient, they were often deadly. Pregnant women, children, and people recovering from illness needed protein and nutrients that were forbidden during fasting periods. Many people died from malnutrition because they followed religious dietary laws even when they were starving. The medieval understanding of nutrition was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, foods were classified as hot or cold, wet or dry, and people needed to balance these qualities to maintain health. This led to dietary advice that was not only useless but often harmful. For example, fresh fruits and vegetables were considered dangerous because they were thought to be too cold and wet. People were advised to avoid raw foods and to cook everything thoroughly, which destroyed vitamins and nutrients. Meat was considered the healthiest food, but most people couldn't afford it, so they lived on a diet of bread and gruel that lacked essential vitamins and minerals. The lack of understanding about vitamins led to widespread deficiency diseases. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was common especially during winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables weren't available. People's teeth would fall out, their gums would bleed, and wounds wouldn't heal. Without understanding the cause, they had no way to prevent or treat the disease. Rickets, caused by lack of vitamin D and calcium, was endemic among children who rarely saw sunlight and had poor diets. Their bones would become soft and deformed, leaving them with permanent disabilities. Night blindness, caused by vitamin A deficiency, was so common that people accepted it as a normal part of aging. Food poisoning was a constant threat in medieval times. Without refrigeration or understanding of bacteria, food would spoil quickly, and people had no reliable way to tell if something was safe to eat. They relied on smell, appearance, and taste, but many dangerous bacteria don't produce obvious signs of spoilage. Botulism, salmonella, and other foodborne illnesses regularly killed medieval people. Symptoms were attributed to bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment, and treatments were usually useless or harmful. People might be bled, purged, or given various herbal remedies that did nothing to address the underlying bacterial infection. The preparation and cooking methods used in medieval times often made food problems worse. Most cooking was done over open fires in poorly ventilated spaces, which filled homes with smoke and created perfect conditions for bacteria to thrive. Cooking utensils were rarely cleaned properly, and the same pots and pans were used for different foods without washing, leading to cross-contamination. Food was often cooked in advance and left sitting at room temperature for hours or even days before being eaten. Stews and porridges were kept warm over low fires, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth. Large communal meals meant that if one dish was contaminated, it could sicken dozens of people at once. The medieval spice trade, often romanticized in popular culture, was actually driven largely by the need to make spoiled food palatable. Spices weren't just luxuries, they were necessities for disguising the taste and smell of rotten meat and fish. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other spices had antibacterial properties that could slow spoilage, but they were so expensive that only the wealthy could afford them. The high cost of spices led to widespread counterfeiting and adulteration. Fake pepper made from juniper berries, fake cinnamon made from tree bark, and fake saffron made from flower petals were common. These substitutes were often harmless, but sometimes they contained toxic substances that could cause illness or death. Even genuine spices could be dangerous. They were often contaminated with dirt, insects, and other foreign matter during the long journey from Asia to Europe. Ships' holds were infested with rats and insects, and spices would absorb moisture and develop mold during the months-long voyage. The medieval kitchen was a hazardous place. Open fires, hot oil, and sharp knives created constant dangers, but the food safety hazards were even worse. Raw meat was often prepared on the same surfaces as other foods, without any understanding of cross-contamination. Hands were rarely washed, and the same knives were used to cut different foods without cleaning. Food storage in medieval kitchens was primitive and often ineffective. Meat was hung in larders that were supposed to be cool and dry, but temperature control was impossible. Food would spoil quickly in warm weather, and even in winter, temperature fluctuations could cause spoilage. Dairy products were particularly problematic. Without pasteurization or effective cooling, milk would sour within hours of being collected. Cheese and butter were made using bacteria and enzymes that weren't well understood, and the results were unpredictable. Sometimes the fermentation process would go wrong, producing cheese that was toxic or indigestible. The medieval diet was monotonous in the extreme. Most people ate the same foods day after day, season after season. In Northern Europe, the typical peasant diet consisted of dark bread, thin ale, and occasional vegetables like onions, leeks, or cabbage. Meat was a rare luxury, usually only available during special occasions or when an animal died of disease or old age. This monotony wasn't just boring, it was nutritionally devastating. Without variety in their diets, people couldn't get the full range of nutrients they needed for good health. They suffered from multiple vitamin deficiencies simultaneously, leading to a host of health problems that weakened their immune systems and made them vulnerable to disease. Seasonal variations made the situation even worse. Spring was known as the hunger gap, when winter stores were exhausted but new crops weren't ready to harvest. People would eat grass, tree bark, and anything else they could find to fill their stomachs. They would make bread from acorns, which required extensive processing to remove toxic tannins, but often wasn't done properly, leading to poisoning. The preservation methods used for vegetables were crude and often ineffective. Vegetables were pickled in brine, but without understanding of proper acidity levels or sterilization, the pickling process often failed. Vegetables would rot in their brine, creating a foul-smelling mess that could still cause food poisoning if eaten. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were stored in root cellars, but these cellars were often damp and poorly ventilated, leading to rot and mold. People would eat moldy vegetables because they had nothing else, not realizing that some molds produce dangerous toxins that can cause liver damage or cancer. The medieval understanding of food safety was based on superstition and folklore rather than science. People believed that certain combinations of foods were dangerous, that eating while angry would cause indigestion, or that food blessed by a priest was safer than unblessed food. These beliefs did nothing to prevent foodborne illness and sometimes made problems worse. For example, people believed that dairy products and fish shouldn't be eaten together because they would curdle in the stomach. This meant that people avoided potentially nutritious combinations of foods based on false beliefs. They also believed that cold foods were dangerous, so they would overcook vegetables until all nutrients were destroyed. The role of women in medieval food preparation was crucial but unrecognized. Women were responsible for most cooking, preservation, and food management, but they had no formal training and learned only from their mothers and other women in their community. Knowledge was passed down through generations, but it was often incomplete or incorrect. Women had to make life or death decisions about food safety with no scientific knowledge to guide them. They had to decide whether meat was too spoiled to eat, whether vegetables were safe after being stored for months, or whether water was clean enough to drink. The wrong decision could kill their entire family, but they had no reliable way to make these judgments. The preparation of food for infants and children was particularly problematic. Without understanding of proper nutrition for growing bodies, children were often given the same food as adults, just in smaller quantities. Babies were fed bread soaked in ale or wine, which could cause alcohol poisoning or choking. Weaning foods were often contaminated or inappropriate. Children were given thin gruel made from whatever grain was available, often mixed with water, that was contaminated with bacteria. Many children died from diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated weaning foods, and those who survived often suffered from stunted growth and developmental problems. The medieval practice of communal eating created perfect conditions for the spread of disease. Large groups of people would eat from common bowls and drink from shared cups, spreading bacteria and viruses throughout the community. Personal hygiene was poor, and people rarely washed their hands before eating. Communal kitchens in monasteries, castles and inns were particularly dangerous. Food was prepared in large quantities and kept warm for hours, allowing bacteria to multiply. Hundreds of people might eat the same contaminated food, leading to mass food poisoning events that could kill dozens of people at once. The medieval banquet, often portrayed as a lavish feast, was actually a health hazard. Food was prepared hours in advance and left sitting at room temperature. Multiple courses meant that some foods would sit for hours before being eaten. The wealthy guests might have had variety, but they also had a higher risk of food poisoning from the elaborate dishes that required complex preparation and lengthy cooking times. Even the wealthy couldn't escape the fundamental problems of medieval food. Their food might have been more varied and better tasting, but it was still preserved using the same primitive methods and prepared in the same unsanitary conditions. They were actually at higher risk for some types of food poisoning because they ate more meat and fish, which spoil more quickly than plant foods. The medieval understanding of meat preparation was rudimentary and dangerous. Animals were often slaughtered under unsanitary conditions, and the meat wasn't properly bled or cleaned. Butchers had no understanding of bacteria or proper temperature control, so meat would begin to spoil immediately after slaughter. Game animals presented particular risks. Wild boar, deer, and other game could carry diseases that could be transmitted to humans. Trichinosis from undercooked pork was common, causing severe illness and sometimes death. People had no understanding of internal cooking temperatures or food safety, so they relied on external appearance to judge whether meat was cooked enough. The preservation of meat through salting was often inadequate. Salt was expensive and often adulterated with other substances, so people used as little as possible. This meant that meat was only partially preserved, creating perfect conditions for harmful bacteria to survive and multiply. Smoking was another common preservation method, but medieval smokehouses were primitive and ineffective. The smoking process was inconsistent, and temperature control was impossible. Some parts of the meat might be properly smoked, while others remained raw and vulnerable to bacterial growth. The medieval fish industry was particularly problematic. Fish markets were located in city centers, where the smell of rotting fish mixed with human waste and other odors to create an almost unbearable stench. Fish was often transported long distances without ice or proper cooling, arriving at market already decomposing. Salted fish was a staple of the medieval diet, but the salting process was often inadequate. Fish would be partially salted and then stored in barrels that weren't properly sealed, allowing bacteria and insects to contaminate the product. The result was fish that was neither fresh nor properly preserved, a perfect breeding ground for harmful bacteria. The medieval dairy industry was equally problematic. Cows, goats, and sheep were often diseased and malnourished, producing milk that was of poor quality and potentially dangerous. Milking was done by hand under unsanitary conditions, and the milk wasn't tested for quality or safety. Butter and cheese were made using traditional methods that weren't well understood. The fermentation process was unpredictable, and products often spoiled before they could be consumed. Cheese was particularly risky because it was aged for long periods without proper temperature or humidity control. The medieval brewing industry produced ale and beer that were safer than water, but still potentially dangerous. Brewers had no understanding of sanitation or quality control, and their products were often contaminated with harmful bacteria. The alcohol content was usually low, so it didn't kill all the bacteria, leaving drinkers vulnerable to illness. The ingredients used in medieval brewing were often adulterated or contaminated. Grains might be moldy or infested with insects, and brewers had no way to test for quality. Hops weren't widely used until later in the medieval period, so ale was preserved using a mixture of herbs called gruit, which sometimes included poisonous plants. The medieval wine industry was similarly problematic. Grapes were often diseased or contaminated with mold, and the fermentation process was unpredictable. Wine was stored in wooden barrels that could harbor bacteria, and it often turned to vinegar before it could be consumed. The transportation of food in medieval times created additional opportunities for contamination. Food was carried in carts pulled by animals exposed to dust, rain, and insects. Long-distance trade meant that food might spend weeks or months in transit, spoiling gradually as it traveled. Markets and fairs were held outdoors, where food was exposed to the elements and contaminated by dust and animal waste. Vendors had no refrigeration or effective way to keep food fresh, so customers had to buy and consume food quickly or risk illness. The regulation of food quality in medieval times was minimal and largely ineffective. Guilds established some standards for their members, but enforcement was sporadic and punishments were often inadequate. Customers had no recourse if they became ill from contaminated food, and vendors faced little consequences for selling spoiled products. The medieval legal system recognized food poisoning as a crime, but proving causation was nearly impossible. Without understanding of bacteria or scientific methods of investigation, authorities couldn't determine whether illness was caused by food, water, or other factors. Most cases of food poisoning went unpunished, and unsafe practices continued unchecked. The impact of poor nutrition on medieval society was profound and far-reaching. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to diseases that well-nourished populations could resist. The average height of medieval Europeans was significantly shorter than modern populations, reflecting chronic malnutrition during childhood development. Life expectancy was low, partly due to food-related illnesses and malnutrition. People who survived childhood often suffered from chronic health problems related to poor diet. Dental problems were universal, caused by coarse bread full of grit and a diet lacking in essential nutrients. The cognitive effects of malnutrition were also significant. Children who didn't get adequate nutrition during critical developmental periods suffered from learning disabilities and reduced intelligence. This created a cycle of poverty and ignorance that was difficult to break. Mental health was also affected by poor nutrition. Deficiencies in certain vitamins and minerals can cause depression, anxiety, and other psychological problems. The medieval understanding of mental illness attributed these symptoms to spiritual causes, so people received religious rather than medical treatment. The social effects of food scarcity created constant tension and conflict. Competition for limited resources led to violence between communities and social classes. Food riots were common when harvests failed or prices rose too high. The hoarding of food by the wealthy while the poor starved created resentment that sometimes erupted into rebellion. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was partly motivated by anger over food inequality. Similar uprisings occurred throughout medieval Europe when food became too scarce or expensive. The environmental impact of medieval agriculture was also problematic. Without understanding of sustainable farming practices, medieval farmers depleted soil nutrients and caused erosion. Deforestation to create farmland led to floods and droughts that made food production even more difficult. The medieval period also saw the beginning of climate change that would affect food production for centuries. The medieval warm period, which lasted from roughly 950 to 1250 CE, was followed by the Little Ice Age, which brought colder temperatures and shorter growing seasons that reduced crop yields and increased the risk of famine. The transition from the medieval period to the Renaissance was partly driven by improvements in food production and preservation. The introduction of new foods from the Americas, improvements in agricultural techniques, and better understanding of nutrition gradually improved the European diet. But change was slow, and many of the problems that plagued medieval food persisted well into the modern era. It wasn't until the development of canning, refrigeration, and scientific understanding of bacteria that food became truly safe and reliable. The legacy of medieval food practices can still be seen today in certain traditional foods and preservation methods. Many European cheeses, cured meats, and fermented foods trace their origins to medieval techniques. But modern food safety regulations and scientific understanding have eliminated most of the dangers that made medieval food so hazardous. Looking back at medieval food culture provides perspective on how far we've come in terms of food safety, nutrition, and variety. It also serves as a reminder of how fragile our food systems can be, and how quickly things can deteriorate when infrastructure breaks down. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of adversity. Despite having access to food that was often dangerous, disgusting, and nutritionally inadequate, medieval people survived and laid the foundation for the modern world. Their struggles with food scarcity and quality helped drive innovations that eventually led to the abundant, safe food supply we enjoy today. But it's important to remember that food insecurity and malnutrition haven't been eliminated. They've just been moved to different parts of the world. The lessons of medieval food remind us that access to safe, nutritious food is not guaranteed and requires constant vigilance and investment in infrastructure, education, and social systems. The medieval period teaches us that food is more than just sustenance. It's a reflection of social structures, technological capabilities, and environmental conditions. The appalling state of medieval food wasn't just an accident of history. It was the inevitable result of a society that lacked the knowledge, technology, and social organization necessary to feed its people properly. Understanding why food was so bad in medieval times helps us appreciate the complex systems that provide us with safe, nutritious food today. It also reminds us that these systems are fragile and must be protected and maintained if we want to avoid returning to the dark days when a simple meal could be a matter of life and death. The 1,000-year struggle with food in medieval Europe shaped the development of Western civilization in profound ways. It drove exploration and trade, motivated scientific research, and influenced social and political structures. The quest for better food was one of the driving forces behind the transformation of medieval society into the modern world. Today, when we complain about food that's bland or overpriced, it's worth remembering our medieval ancestors who would have considered our worst food to be a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. The evolution from medieval food to modern food represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, the conquest of hunger, malnutrition, and foodborne disease. But this achievement is not complete and it's not permanent. Climate change, population growth, and environmental degradation threaten our food systems in ways that echo the challenges faced by medieval Europeans. Understanding how our ancestors struggled with food insecurity can help us prepare for the challenges we may face in the future. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story about human adaptation and survival. Despite facing food that was often dangerous and disgusting, medieval people found ways to survive and even thrive. They developed preservation techniques, cooking methods, and social institutions that helped them cope with scarcity and danger. Their innovations laid the groundwork for the food systems we have today. Medieval brewing techniques evolved into modern beer production. Medieval preservation methods led to modern canning and refrigeration. Medieval agricultural practices were gradually refined into modern farming techniques. The social institutions that developed around food in medieval times also had lasting impacts. Guilds that regulated food quality evolved into modern food safety agencies. Religious dietary laws influenced modern nutritional guidelines. Medieval hospitality customs became the foundation of modern restaurant culture. The medieval period was a time of experimentation and innovation in food. Even though many experiments failed and many innovations were inadequate, medieval cooks and farmers were constantly trying new techniques and ingredients, seeking ways to make their food safer, more nutritious, and more palatable. Some of these experiments were successful and became enduring traditions. Others were disasters that served as cautionary tales for future generations. But all of them contributed to the gradual accumulation of knowledge that eventually led to modern food science. The medicinal use of food in medieval times, while often misguided, showed an early understanding of the connection between diet and health. Medieval physicians prescribed specific foods for various ailments, and while their theories were wrong, their observations sometimes led to useful discoveries. The medieval spice trade, driven by the need to preserve and flavor food, created the economic networks that would eventually span the globe. The search for better food preservation led to exploration, colonization, and the development of international commerce. The social aspects of medieval food, the communal meals, the religious significance of eating, the role of food in hospitality and diplomacy, established patterns that persist today. Food remained central to human social interaction, even when the food itself was barely edible. The regional variations in medieval food reflected local environmental conditions, cultural traditions, and economic circumstances. These variations eventually evolved into the distinct national cuisines we recognize today, each with its own history of adaptation to local challenges. The gradual improvement of medieval food over the course of the period shows human ingenuity and persistence in the face of adversity. Each generation built on the knowledge of previous generations, slowly developing better techniques for growing, preserving, and preparing food. The transition from medieval to Renaissance food marked a turning point in human history. The introduction of new foods from the Americas, the development of better preservation techniques, and the growth of trade networks created possibilities that medieval people could never have imagined. But this transition also created new problems and inequalities. The benefits of improved food were not evenly distributed, and many people continued to suffer from malnutrition and food insecurity, even as the wealthy enjoyed unprecedented variety and quality in their diets. The lessons of medieval food remain relevant today as we face new challenges in feeding a growing global population while protecting the environment and ensuring food security for all. The medieval experience shows us what happens when food systems fail, and why it's so important to maintain robust, sustainable food production and distribution networks. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human survival and adaptation in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Despite having access to food that was often dangerous, disgusting, and inadequate, medieval people not only survived, but created the foundation for the modern world. Their struggles with food taught them lessons about cooperation, innovation, and resilience that served them well in other areas of life. The medieval period was a time of tremendous hardship, but it was also a time of learning and growth that prepared humanity for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. As we face our own food challenges in the 21st century, climate change, population growth, environmental degradation, and inequality, we can learn from the medieval experience. Their story reminds us that food security is not guaranteed, that it requires constant effort and innovation, and that the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. But their story also shows us that humans are remarkably adaptable and resourceful when faced with adversity. Medieval people found ways to survive and even flourish despite having access to food that would horrify modern eaters. Their resilience and ingenuity provide inspiration for facing our own challenges. The 1,000-year struggle with food in medieval Europe was one of the defining experiences of Western civilization. It shaped our ancestors' worldview, motivated their innovations, and influenced their social and political institutions. Understanding this struggle helps us understand how we became who we are today. The transformation of medieval food into modern food represents one of humanity's greatest triumphs over adversity. It shows what we can accomplish when we combine scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and social cooperation. But it also reminds us that these achievements are fragile and must be protected if we want to avoid returning to the dark days when a simple meal could be a matter of life and death. The medieval period ended not with a sudden revolution in food production, but with gradual improvements that accumulated over centuries. Each small innovation built on previous discoveries, slowly creating the foundation for the food systems we have today. This reminds us that progress often comes through persistent effort rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The social changes that accompanied improvements in medieval food were equally important. As food became more reliable and varied, it freed people to pursue other activities besides the constant struggle for survival. This contributed to the intellectual and cultural flowering of the Renaissance and the modern era. The medieval experience with food also demonstrates the importance of trade and cultural exchange in improving human welfare. The gradual expansion of trade networks brought new foods, preservation techniques, and cooking methods to Europe, enriching the diet and improving nutrition. But trade also brought new risks and dependencies. Communities that became dependent on imported food were vulnerable when trade routes were disrupted by war, disease, or political upheaval. This tension between the benefits and risks of trade continues to influence food policy today. The environmental lessons of medieval food production are particularly relevant in our current era of climate change and environmental degradation. Medieval farmers learned through bitter experience that unsustainable practices would eventually lead to soil depletion, erosion, and reduced yields. Their gradual development of crop rotation, selective breeding, and other sustainable practices laid the foundation for modern agriculture. But they also made mistakes that we can learn from, such as deforestation and overgrazing that damaged ecosystems and reduced agricultural productivity. The medieval struggle with food preservation and safety also provides lessons for modern food systems. Their trial and error approach to preservation techniques shows the importance of scientific understanding in developing safe and effective methods for keeping food fresh. Their experience with foodborne illness demonstrates the deadly consequences of inadequate food safety measures. This reminds us why modern food safety regulations and inspection systems are so important, even when they seem burdensome or expensive. The social and economic aspects of medieval food distribution offer insights into modern issues of food equity and access. The medieval system that concentrated the best food among the wealthy while leaving the poor to subsist on scraps created social tensions that eventually contributed to political upheaval. This historical experience reminds us that food security is not just about producing enough food, it's also about ensuring that food is distributed fairly and that everyone has access to adequate nutrition. The consequences of food inequality can be severe and long-lasting. The role of women in medieval food systems was crucial, but often overlooked. Women were responsible for most food preparation, preservation, and household food management, but their knowledge and skills were not formally recognized or valued. This historical pattern of undervaluing women's contributions to food systems continues to influence gender roles and economic opportunities today. The religious and cultural aspects of medieval food also had lasting impacts. Dietary laws and fasting practices shaped eating habits and food preferences in ways that persisted long after the religious justifications were forgotten. Understanding these historical influences helps explain modern food preferences and cultural practices. The medieval experience with seasonal variation in food availability reminds us of the importance of diversity and resilience in food systems. Medieval people learned to make the most of seasonal abundance while preparing for times of scarcity. This knowledge about seasonal eating and food preservation remains valuable today. The gradual improvement of medieval food over time shows the importance of accumulated knowledge and cultural learning. Each generation built on the experiences of their predecessors, slowly developing better techniques and practices. This process of incremental improvement continues today in modern food science and technology. The regional variations in medieval food reflect the influence of local environmental conditions, cultural traditions, and economic circumstances. Understanding these historical patterns helps explain the development of distinct regional cuisines and food cultures that enrich our modern food landscape. The medieval period's ending marked not just an improvement in food quality and availability, but also a transformation in human consciousness about food. People began to see food not just as sustenance for survival, but as something that could be enjoyed, experimented with, and improved upon. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. For centuries, medieval people had accepted that food would be scarce, dangerous, and often disgusting. They developed elaborate social and religious justifications for this suffering, viewing hunger and poor food as tests of faith or natural conditions of earthly existence. The idea that food could be abundant, safe, and delicious was almost unthinkable. The gradual emergence from medieval food conditions required not just technological innovations, but psychological and cultural transformations. People had to learn to expect better food, to demand higher standards, and to invest in improvements rather than simply accepting whatever they could get. This transformation didn't happen overnight or everywhere at once. Different regions and social classes experienced improvements at different rates. Urban areas generally saw improvements before rural areas, and the wealthy experienced better food long before these improvements reached the poor. Some communities remained trapped in medieval food conditions well into the modern era. The persistence of medieval food practices in some areas created stark contrasts that highlighted how much conditions had improved elsewhere. Travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries wrote detailed accounts of regional variations in food quality, noting the dramatic differences between progressive areas and those that remained stuck in medieval conditions. These accounts provide valuable insights into the transition process and the factors that promoted or hindered improvement. Areas with good transportation links, active trade, political stability, and educational institutions generally improved faster than isolated, war-torn, or economically stagnant regions. The role of cities in improving food conditions was particularly important. Urban markets created demand for higher quality food and provided incentives for farmers and food producers to improve their methods. Competition between vendors led to gradual improvements in quality and safety. Cities also served as centers for the exchange of information about food production, preservation, and preparation techniques. Urban guilds established standards and training programs that helped spread better practices. The concentration of wealth in cities created markets for imported foods and luxury ingredients that gradually became more widely available. The development of printing in the late medieval period accelerated the spread of knowledge about food and cooking. Recipe books, agricultural manuals, and medical texts could be reproduced and distributed more widely, allowing innovations to spread faster than ever before. But printed information also perpetuated some medieval misconceptions about food and nutrition. Many early printed books repeated traditional beliefs about the four humours and other incorrect theories. It took time for scientific understanding to replace traditional folklore in published materials. The Protestant Reformation had unexpected effects on food culture by changing attitudes toward fasting and dietary restrictions. Protestant areas often abandoned Catholic fasting practices, which reduced nutritional stress during traditional hunger periods. This religious change contributed to improved nutrition and health in Protestant regions. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded by modifying some traditional practices and emphasizing charity and food distribution to the poor. This religious competition sometimes led to improvements in food security, as different denominations tried to demonstrate their care for people's physical as well as spiritual welfare. The Age of Exploration brought dramatic changes to European food by introducing new crops from the Americas. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and beans eventually transformed European agriculture and nutrition, though adoption was often slow and met with suspicion. The introduction of these new foods created possibilities that medieval people could never have imagined. A single potato plant could produce more calories per acre than traditional grains, offering hope for ending the cycles of famine that had plagued Europe for centuries. But the transition to new foods also created new vulnerabilities. The Irish dependence on potatoes led to catastrophic famine when potato blight struck in the 1840s. This showed that even improved food systems could be fragile if they lacked diversity and resilience. The development of new preservation techniques in the post-medieval period gradually eliminated many of the health hazards that had made medieval food so dangerous. The invention of canning in the early 19th century, followed by refrigeration and pasteurization, finally made it possible to store and transport food safely over long distances and extended periods. These technological innovations had profound social and economic effects. They made it possible to feed large urban populations, support industrial development, and create global food markets. They also reduced the seasonal variation in food availability that had been a fact of life for millennia. The scientific revolution that began in the late medieval period eventually led to understanding of bacteria, vitamins, and other factors that affect food safety and nutrition. This knowledge made it possible to prevent the diseases and deficiencies that had killed millions of medieval people. But scientific understanding developed slowly and unevenly. Many food-related health problems persisted well into the modern era because people didn't understand their causes or how to prevent them. The transition from medieval to modern food was a gradual process that took centuries to complete. The Industrial Revolution accelerated food improvements by making new technologies and ingredients more widely available. Factory production of food items standardized quality and reduced costs, making better food accessible to more people. But industrialization also created new problems, including food adulteration, environmental pollution, and the loss of traditional food knowledge. The mass production of food sometimes prioritized quantity and profit over quality and safety. The development of modern food regulation and inspection systems was partly a response to the problems created by industrialization. Governments gradually recognized the need to protect consumers from unsafe or adulterated food products. These regulatory systems built on medieval precedents but were much more comprehensive and scientifically based. They represented a recognition that food safety was too important to leave entirely to market forces or traditional practices. The social aspects of food also changed dramatically as medieval conditions gave way to modern abundance. Communal eating remained important. But the constant anxiety about food security that had characterized medieval meals gradually diminished in developed countries. Food began to serve new social and cultural functions as survival became less of a concern. Cuisine developed as an art form, cooking became a source of pleasure and creativity, and food became a way to express cultural identity and social status. The emergence of restaurants, cookbooks, and food criticism reflected this transformation. Food was no longer just about avoiding starvation. It became a source of enjoyment, social interaction, and cultural expression. But this transformation was not universal or complete. Many parts of the world continued to struggle with food insecurity and malnutrition, even as other regions achieved abundance. The global inequality in food access echoed the social inequalities of medieval Europe. The environmental costs of escaping medieval food conditions became apparent over time. Modern agriculture's use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, while increasing yields, created new environmental problems. The expansion of farmland often came at the expense of forests and other natural habitats. The transportation and processing systems that made modern food possible also contributed to environmental problems, including greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and resource depletion. The environmental sustainability of modern food systems became a growing concern. Climate change now threatens to create new food security challenges that could potentially return some regions to medieval-like conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. This possibility reminds us that the transition from medieval food was not necessarily permanent or irreversible. The lessons learned from the medieval experience with food remain relevant as we face new challenges. The importance of diversity in food systems, the need for sustainable production methods, and the social consequences of food inequality are all issues that medieval people would recognize. The medieval struggle with food also demonstrates the importance of knowledge, technology, and social cooperation in maintaining food security. These factors were crucial in the transition from medieval to modern food, and they remain essential today. Understanding the medieval food experience helps us appreciate the complexity and fragility of modern food systems. The abundance and safety we take for granted today required centuries of innovation, investment, and social development to achieve. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story about human progress and the possibility of improvement even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Medieval people created the foundation for the food systems we have today through their persistence, creativity, and gradual accumulation of knowledge. Their experience shows that progress is possible but not inevitable. It requires continued effort, investment, and attention to maintain and improve food systems. The medieval experience serves as both an inspiration for what humans can accomplish and a warning about what can happen when food systems fail. The thousand-year struggle with food in medieval Europe shaped the development of Western civilization in ways that continue to influence us today. The values, institutions, and practices that emerged from this struggle became part of our cultural heritage and continue to shape our relationship with food. The transformation from medieval to modern, food represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, but it also reminds us of our ongoing responsibilities. We must continue to work to ensure that everyone has access to safe, nutritious food, while protecting the environmental systems that make food production possible. The medieval experience teaches us that food security is not just about producing enough food. It's about creating sustainable, equitable, and resilient food systems that can adapt to changing conditions while meeting human needs. This lesson remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, population growth, environmental degradation, and persistent inequality, we can draw inspiration from our medieval ancestors who overcame seemingly impossible obstacles to create the foundation for the abundance we enjoy today. Their story reminds us that even the most difficult problems can be solved through human ingenuity, cooperation, and persistence. The transformation from medieval food to modern food shows what we can accomplish when we work together toward common goals. But their story also warns us about the consequences of complacency and the importance of maintaining the systems and institutions that protect our food security. The medieval experience shows how quickly conditions can deteriorate when these systems fail or are neglected. The legacy of medieval food continues to influence our world in both obvious and subtle ways. Many of our food preferences, cooking, techniques, and cultural practices trace their origins to medieval innovations and adaptations. Understanding this history helps us make better decisions about food policy, agricultural practices, and environmental protection. It also helps us appreciate the remarkable journey that brought us from the dark days of medieval food to the abundance and variety we enjoy today. The story of why food sucked in medieval times is ultimately a story about human resilience and the power of gradual improvement. It shows that even the most fundamental problems can be solved over time through persistent effort and accumulated knowledge. As we continue to face food-related challenges in our own time, we can take inspiration from our ancestors who refused to accept that bad food was inevitable. Their determination to create better conditions for themselves and their children laid the foundation for the world we live in today. The medieval struggle with food reminds us that progress is possible, but it requires commitment, cooperation, and the willingness to invest in long-term solutions. The 1,000-year journey from medieval food to modern abundance shows what we can accomplish when we work together toward a better future. Their example challenges us to continue that work today, to build on their achievements, and to create food systems that are not only abundant and safe, but also sustainable and equitable for all. The story of medieval food is not just history. It's a guide for creating a better future.